Hello, everybody. It's Dinowitz for Mythic Writer. Today, talking about science fiction, fantasy, horror, and why these three are often lumped together. I've got some books on my shelf, how to write science fiction, fantasy, and I always kind of wondered why were these three things lumped together? They seem so different. Well, we're going to talk about that today and how it can help you to improve aspects of your writing and possibly use more than one genre in your writing a little bit. And I want to kind of talk about how so many popular movies or books do use different elements from genre genres. The first one I want to talk about, of course, something we all know is Star Wars. Most people would consider Star Wars a science fiction story, and I think that's pretty close. I think a lot of people would also just label it a fantasy. I think a lot of people would look at Star Trek and see Star Trek as a little bit more true science fiction in that they are trying to sometimes explain technology, or the technology is being used in, a scientific way, an advanced way. Although there are elements of fantasy, obviously, in Star Trek too. Where in Star Wars, the technology itself is just sort of assumed, which is kind of what made Star Wars interesting. There was never anyone talking about, well, here's how the X-wing fighter works and propels, and no one really cared. People just accepted, wow, we can get in a little spaceship and just fly from planet to planet. We didn't want to hear an explanation of it. So Star Wars really does sit on the fantasy science fiction realm, just because it's set in what seems to be a futuristic world, although it tells us it was a long, long time ago. It doesn't mean that it's pure science fiction. Now, Star Wars also uses elements of horror in it, and of course, I think the most obvious thing is Darth Vader. He's actually kind of a scary looking dude, right? Darth Vader is very scary, and he has a weird voice. He has a weird costume. He's not very nice through most of the film. And you'll notice also in the Empire Strikes Back, where Luke goes to the swamp area to train, that he is in a cave at one point. And this is a classic mythic fiction motive, entering the inner cave, going into the dark place, the dark night of the soul, if you will. And when he walks into the cave and faces Darth Vader and, sees an image of himself in the mask. So that's a lot of metaphor playing on there. Is the evil within him? Is he connected to Darth Vader? Stuff like that is going on there. Deep stuff. But that when I watch that, it's foggy, it's creepy. That could be in a horror movie, but because Star Wars isn't an action adventure / fantasy science fiction movie, we don't sit there and think of it, oh, I'm scared, as we're watching it, because that's not the overall arching goal of Star Wars, to make you feel fear. And that's really where you come down to what separates a horror story from fantasy or science fiction. Horror is clearly trying to fill you with dread, suspense, terror, mystery throughout the better part of the film. Where a fantasy, like, let's say, Lord of the Rings, is not really trying to scare you for the most part. But definitely when they're being chased by those orcs and all, these different creatures, some of them are pretty scary. I thought, boy, this is just like a horror movie when they're like hiding and they're on those crazy things are on their horses. That was really scary. But once again, because your mind is wrapped up in the overall adventure of Lord of the Rings and their goal and where they're going, you're not feeling the same way you would if you were watching Michael Myers chase somebody. It's just different, but the element is there. Then we look at something like The Wizard of Oz, clearly a fantasy novel, fantasy movie, but we see there's a wicked witch, and she is supposed to be scary. She's literally trying to kill Dorothy. So that's an interesting departure for a story like that, something that really was aimed at kids. She's really got a, very dastardly goal in mind. And so Dorothy is just sort of at the behest of the witch who's chasing her all around. And let me get the keyboard out here. And you'd say, well, that's not a horror story, but yet there's a witch, right? So there's a witch in the story. And witches are typically thought of as something from the realm of horror. But once again, there's a little crossover there. Wizard of Oz uses comedy in a lot of parts of it. But yet then there's the scary monkeys, the flying monkeys. I remember being a little kid watching that. That to me, that was the part that was the creepiest, was those flying monkeys. So there's a little bit of horror in The Wizard of Oz, but you never start to think to yourself, this is a horror movie, because the overall arching emotion that the writer is trying to emit is not one of terror and keeping you up at night. It's fun. It's adventure. Also, Harry Potter. Now let's look at Harry Potter. Here's another fantasy novel or movie, whichever one you watched, series. Clearly fantasy. I think everyone would agree it's just a fantasy novel series. But there are parts in the Harry Potter series, obviously, where a werewolf appears. So obviously werewolves are totally in the realm of horror. Harry Potter has a lot of scary scenes in it, where, with Voldemort coming after him, or in dreams or in visions and so forth. And he's obviously kind of a creepy, scary looking dude. He's something right out of a horror movie. But then again, the overall emotion of Harry Potter is not fear. It is fantasy. It is adventure. It is, some realm of excitement, if you will. And that's what they're shooting for. So sorry if my hair is totally crazy. I get these headphones, do a number on you. Tried some different ones here today. But anyway, Harry Potter goes and is dealing with a lot of mysterious things. There's witches, they're flying. They're in the school of, wizardry. There's a wizard, obviously. And that's the same thing. We go back to Lord of the Rings. There's a wizard, witches, wizards, sort of Halloween type things, but yet wizards, we normally, I think, have come to think of them as a character from the fantasy novel more than a horror novel. So Harry Potter has those aspects. And then you say, what about the other way around? Are there horror novels that have aspects of fantasy in them? Well, there are, and they're harder to think of, but I thought of a couple that I thought were interesting. One of them is by Ray Bradbury, called Something Wicked This Way Comes. I would consider this the perfect example. This really was a horror novel. It was, in my mind, kind of geared towards a young adult crowd, but as an adult, I still enjoy this book and this movie. The movie is a very close rendition to the book, one of the closest that you'll ever see in Hollywood, actually. Sometimes I watch the movie version of Something Wicked This Way Comes and think, how did this movie ever get made? It was just a perfect version. There's really only like maybe one scene that's altered or a little different from the book. It's just great. So Something Wicked This Way Comes really is kind of trying to scare you a little bit. It's not trying to put you in the state of terror like a movie like Halloween or Saw or The Ring, stuff like that. But it's a horror novel. It's weird things are going on. Supernatural beings are there. People are meeting dark fates. The thing that I think makes a lot of people pull back from feeling like that's a big full-fledged horror novel and might say it's fantasy is just Ray Bradbury's style. his style as a writer is not all about just sheer terror and focusing on the plot. He focuses on character a lot. And when you dive down deep into character, sometimes it comes off with the aspect of not being totally deep horror. Some of Stephen King's work, especially his later work, really dives into character in a way, into the story in a way that some people think, oh, this isn't pure horror. But and some of his stories aren't. So even Stephen King has veered off in his career. But Something Wicked This Way Comes has many elements of horror, but it sort of has fantasy. There's sort of an adventure. There's a couple of friends. They're discovering some new things with this bizarre carnival that comes to town. Their dad, one boy's dad, Will's dad, is kind of on an adventure of his own to see if his life has passed him by, if there's any youth left in him, if he does have a second shot at a different type of life. So there's a lot of adventure going on there, but there are a lot of creepy things going on in that movie. Now, another horror movie is Jaws. Jaws is clearly a horror movie, yet in the old days when we had video stores, you'd go into the video store and hardly ever find Jaws in the horror section. It'd always be in like action adventure. So a lot of people over the years have come to think of Jaws as an action adventure movie, but plain and simple, Jaws is a horror movie. I don't care who you are. You can argue about this all day long if you want, but Jaws is a horror movie. Jaws has got a monster in it that's trying to eat people and becoming very successful at doing so. And the overall emotion of Jaws is terror. You're worried, you're afraid. Every time someone goes in the water, you get nervous. That's Jaws. But yes, Jaws does have elements of action adventure in it. And Jaws also has fantasy in a way. The shark's maybe a little bit bigger than we would expect a real shark to be. Interesting enough, I actually saw one of the mechanical sharks from Jaws at COSI years ago. And the thing was enormous. It really was. Like, if you really saw that in the water, it would be terrifying. It was, it was like 30 feet long. It was huge. And its mouth really was big enough that like I'm like 6'1". I could have laid in that mouth, maybe had my feet sticking out. I mean, it was huge. And it moved a little bit. And even though it was in a museum and you knew it was fake, it was still creepy. So Jaws was definitely a horror movie, but it had some fantasy elements. They go out in the boat. There's a group of friends and they're searching for this shark and they're trying to save the town. That sounds a lot like Lord of the Rings, doesn't it? It has that Lord of the Rings adventure feel to it. Has a little bit of a Star Wars, right? Group of friends get together on a big adventure, trying to save everybody. So you see how these stories are so similar, and yet nobody would ever probably say Jaws, Star Wars, Wizard of Oz, Harry Potter, and Lord of the Rings had much in common, except maybe Lord of the Rings. It kind of feels a little Harry Potterish, doesn't it? But this is why I want to point out, when you are writing whatever genre you're writing in, don't be afraid to grab a little piece of another genre, because it can really make your novel great. If Jaws had just been about a shark attacking people on the beach and people kind of standing on the beach and trying to shoot the shark, I don't think Jaws would have had the same impact that it did. I think the part about the sheriff and Matt and all them going together boat and going out after the shark, hunting the shark, they become the hunters. I think that really turned that movie, and it made it into I don't want to call it a buddy flick, but the book, obviously there's a little more contention between some of the characters if you read the book, but in the movie version, I actually like the movie version better. Jaws is the one book that I actually thought the movie was better than the book, which you'll hardly ever hear me say. I really think Jaws movie better than the book. I didn't like in the book some of the things that happened with the oceanographer. Matt Hooper, I think it was his name. And I didn't like that. And it's more of a little bit of a buddy flick in the movie. But it was definitely a horror movie, obviously. And if you didn't think it was a horror movie, how many people that watch that still get freaked out even jumping in a swimming pool? I mean, come on. So let's look at this. This is why sci-fi, horror, and fantasy are lumped together. They're so similar. They often share aspects from each other, and you can use different aspects from each genre to enhance whatever you're working on. Sci-fi has always been a kissing cousin to horror. A lot of movies from the 50s, if you take some time to go back and watch some of these movies, a lot of them are pretty cheesy, but they're fun to watch. A lot of them were listed as sci-fi. Technically, they were horror, but they often used some element of science to explain what was going on. Even Godzilla kind of used, nuclear waste or whatever, created this monster. It wasn't just a monster that showed up. But there was all these weird movies, The Blob and things like that. And I like, the giant tomatoes. I mean, yeah, I'm scared of tomatoes. When tomatoes get scary, it's time to just wrap it up, folks. But you could see a lot of those were listed as sci-fi. They used elements of horror. They were cheesy for the most part. Another one that people often talk about is Frankenstein. And a lot of people call that a horror novel or horror movie. Technically, a lot of people will tell you that technically Frankenstein is a science fiction novel. And then that flips everything on your head. You're like, I don't know, there's monsters chasing people. People are screaming. People maybe getting killed. Yep. So that makes Frankenstein a real good contender of both those two genres. Because technically, science has been used to explain how he makes the monster. So he's, putting body parts together. He's using electricity from lightning to bring life to the creature. So it's not just a mythical creature or supernatural creature. He didn't raise it from the dead using some kind of necromonicon spell or, some kind of Satanism. He used science to bring it to life. So it was presented as something realistic, and it was science that got out of control and became the monster. It was really the science that was supposed to be the monster and the villain of that, not necessarily Frankenstein's actual monster that he built. So this becomes a fine line. And, it doesn't matter if you want to call Frankenstein a horror novel or a horror movie. It is scary. And I think in a lot of way, part of it is that I really think Frankenstein's the perfect example of something that walks the sci-fi horror line and is on both sides of the line and not solidly on either one side of the line. Because really the whole story is not, and if you're just going by movies, there's been a lot of movie versions, but the whole story is originally conceived is not just to scare you from beginning to end. Kind of a good story, and then it makes you think about our ethics and limits that we should put on ourselves as humans and scientists. So Frankenstein is a great example. So that's all I want to talk to you about today here on Mythic Writer. Hope this gives you some food for thought. Don't be afraid to play around if you're writing a little bit. Take a little from this genre and that genre. And now you know why these genres always seem to be lumped together. Until next time, I hope you all have a good time and hang in there, you mythic writers.